Hey everybody. So today we are going to talk about political socialization and public opinion. And the first thing that we want to do is define what public opinion is. And public opinion can be defined as the total of individual beliefs and attitudes expressed on a particular subject. It doesn't describe behaviors. People can say one thing and believe one thing and act a completely different way. Now, for it to be public opinion, there's some things that we should mention is that it has to be expressed, right? That if you're not saying it, then it's not public. And so when you hear people talk about this sort of a great silent majority, you don't know in terms of public opinion because they haven't said anything about what they believe. And public opinion also has to have an issue in which there's a pro and a con. We don't have public opinion on whether this is a cell phone. It's a cell phone. Now, you can have public opinion on whether Android is better than Apple. You can do that. That's public opinion. And you certainly can do that. So it's got to have an issue of pro or con. And so public opinion has to be on a general or social issue, not a private one. We can't really have public opinion on whether or not I'm a good dog owner because people don't know. So what we need to discuss then is what impacts your public opinion. And you may have heard the term socialization. And I always tell my classes the best way to understand socialization is looking at the suffix, the word ization. Ization implies a process, right? Whether that's immunization, pasteurization, naturalization. These are all implying a process, and socialization is implying a process. Socialization is the process in which you learn the rules or norms of society, right? Like, for example, you don't go to some fancy dinner and decide to burp really loud afterwards because you would think that's rude. Well, that's only rude in this country. There are other countries where that might be considered complimentary to the host. But we learn the rules or norms of society. And that's really one of the major public reasons for public schools is to adapt you to certain rules or norms of our society. But we're not interested in regular socialization. We're interested in political socialization, in which where you learn your political norms or your political values. And there are a lot of places where you can learn those. Now, your book divides these up between primary and secondary. I'm not going to necessarily always agree with what your book says, but for testing purposes on this issue alone, it should be followed on a test of what your book says, but I'll give you some contrary opinions to that. So when we look at political socialization, where you learn your political values, your political norms, like I said, there are primary and secondary factors. And let's go through some of these factors. And we'll start off with primary. Primary would include your family. And I always take this point is where you think, where do you spend most of your formative years? Well, with your family, right? Now, this doesn't mean that if your family are all Democrats or they're all Republicans, that you're going to be a Republican or a Democrat. You might be the opposite party, but that doesn't mean that they didn't impact you, right? You may have rebelled or, listened to those thoughts and rejected them for whatever reason. So you do spend a lot of time with your family, and that's where we adopt a lot of our political values. Now, we know that if your values are going to change from that of your families, your political thoughts, that is, it's going to be because of education. Education is another primary factor because with education, again, think how much time you spend in education. You spend 12 years in public schools. And again, the public schools are all designed to teach you how to be a good citizen, right? If you remember early on in elementary school, you would have citizenship grades. In fact, the reason for the public schools in the 1880s was to take immigrants and Americanize them. And the further you go up the educational ladder, the more it has an impact on you. I mean, you certainly can see that in these last few elections on the educational levels, and I would suggest you go look that up as a point of interest on educational levels in support of a particular candidate, whether it was Trump or Biden, or if we want to go back to 2016, Trump or Clinton. Go look up the educational differences. Now, getting a college degree is important because it means that you're more likely, doesn't mean absolutely, you're more likely to vote. You're also more likely to be tolerant of other people because you've learned that in school. And so these are important things to remember about why college education is important. It doesn't mean that you can't have college educated bigots. You certainly can, or college educated people who are completely apathetic about voting. Certainly can. And it doesn't mean that people who didn't go to college can't be just as tolerant as anybody else and also vote a lot. But it's just meaning that they're more likely to vote and more likely to be tolerant of other people. It's just a pattern, not an absolute rule. So let's make sure we know that. Now, your book says church tends to be a primary one. I'd argue, and remember, if it's on the test, go with church. I would argue that churches tend to be secondary, mainly because of the amount of time we spend and the number of people that are declining as part of a organized religion. But we do know this, that church does impact people on some of their political views. For example, we know that if you take the Bible literally, right, word for word, that's going to impact some of your political views as opposed to taking it allegorically, right? To sum that up, saying that when Jonah was swallowed by a great fish, you can take that literally, that yes, he was, or you can take it as a parable of us trying to teach you a moral truth. And those things can impact your political views. But I would argue, again, that it's limited, right? I mean, certainly your religion can impact your views on abortion, divorce, gay rights, but where does it impact you on zoning laws, interest rates, Wall Street regulations? It's a tricky thing there that can go back and forth. Now, secondary, your book refers to your peers, your friends. I've seen other books say that's primary, but your book says secondary. We tend to hang around people that we like, and we try to fit in. We do have a somewhat of a conformist nature. We don't hang around people we hate, unless you're at work. I'm kidding. I like all my coworkers. But you're often concerned about what your peers think, right? And then they also listed as a secondary factor, media. Now, I'd almost argue, and I argue both ways on this one, media can be a primary factor or it can be a secondary factor. Again, because the amount of time that you're spending, especially on social media is going to have an impact on your beliefs. And it also allows you to be caught into sort of a vacuum where, social media algorithms know what you like to see and they keep feeding you the same information. So if you're a Republican, they're going to just give you all this particular type of information. If you're a Democrat, it's another one, completely different. And we know that there's so much false information out there on social media, and it does have an impact. But for the record, your book, and go by this on test day, your book says that your family, education, religion are primary, media and peers are secondary. So just in case you need to know that. Well, so how do Americans think politically? Well, often it's by party identification. We see that a lot today. We see more likely that those people that are really involved in a party tend to think very little of the other party. In fact, the word evil actually pops up. And if you're one of those people, my advice to you is stop it. They're not evil. They are your fellow citizens who have different points of view, no matter how strong you have with them. So stop it. But party identification plays a very important role, especially in a lot of these the elections we see in Texas. People will straight ticket vote. And ideology plays a role too. Ideology is just sort of that general belief about the role and purpose of government. What do you think government should do? You know, I don't know if you talked about this at the beginning. This is really one of the fundamental questions in American politics. What is the role of the government? Is it the government's job to provide health care? Is it the government's job to help you with higher education, protect the environment? What is the role of the government? And it's one of the big debates that we have in American politics today. That still goes on. To note, historically, Americans tend to be economic conservatives, but social liberals. That tends to be the majority, meaning that you don't like taxes, you don't like a lot of government spending, but you don't like telling other people what they can and cannot do. That's been a majority of Americans. Now, you can have people who are social conservatives and economic conservatives and vice versa, but a large percentage of Americans have that sort of individualistic type idea is that, hey, low taxes, little government, hey, but let people do what they want to do. And so it sort of splits you between the parties. Now, we've seen a rise of a populist movement lately, which tends to be economic liberals and social conservatives. And I would argue that these populists, I think that's primarily where Trump has excelled, is with this sort of a populist movement that's been out there. And we've seen populist movements throughout American history, and this is just the latest. So people can also identify for themselves based on their economic class. You know, where do you think your economic class is? I'm not going to go into a great detail about that. They're going to, the region they live in, you know, whether you're a Southerner, a Northerner, or a Northeasterner, people will see themselves from the region they live in. I mean, if you've been to Alaska, Alaskans very proud. Gender. We do know that there are gender differences between genders on different issues. This is sometimes referred to as the gender gap. And then, of course, age. Age plays a part. I don't know how many times, and by the way, young people don't fall into this trap. My mother will say, well, young people today, blah, 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 blah. And then I hear it from other people that young people don't have respect today. Well, you know, go back and watch 1950s TV or watch 1930s movies where they're talking about how young people don't have respect and young people don't do this. And go back and listen to Ben Franklin talk about it or Aristotle talk about it. Young people, you're doing just fine. Trust me, you're doing just fine. Don't let old people like me tell you that you're doing anything else. Certainly, race plays a part. We know that there are racial issues that divide us as well on policy. That's not surprising, I think, to anybody. Certainly, religion plays a part too. We see schisms in religion. This isn't anything new historically either. I mean, if you're wondering why there's a Methodist church and a Southern Methodist church and a Baptist church and a Southern Baptist church, Civil War, issue of slavery. So we can certainly see religious differences that go about. And so then I guess my next question is, how do we measure public opinion? Right? We decide what creates it, what influences it. Well, the primary way we do it is through polling. Polling is simply doing a random sample of people to determine what they think. Now, polls aren't completely accurate. If you look at a poll, there'll be a little number off to the side that says plus or minus 5%. That's how far the poll can be off. And don't fall into this belief that in 2016, the polls were way off. They really weren't. The national polls were pretty spot on. Some of the state polls were within the margin of error off. And remember, Trump wins that election by just squeaking out some key votes in some of the swing states. The polls seem a little bit further off this time. So what is causing this problem with polls? Well, part of it is cell phones. When people had landlines, it was easier to call. A lot of polling data can't get through this cell phone here. And there's always this this belief that people don't want to tell you anything what they're thinking to a pollster. So polls can be off, but keep in mind, don't let politicians tell you how wrong polls are, because politicians hire pollsters and they're polling every day. But what does this do? What's this impact of polling and public opinion have on public policy? Well, it certainly impacts public policy. You know, there's two theories, and I think you've probably already covered this, about what does representation mean. And one of them is the delegate theory, and one of them is the trustee theory. The delegate theory says that you should just vote for what the people want you to vote. Well, a lot of you might say, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." Well, how do you know what the people want? I mean, if you're a U.S. representative and you have 700,000 people in your district, how do you know what they want on the 10,000 bills they hear? Most of those people are going to be caught up on those, right? Now, you might act as a delegate when you know the general feeling in your district about, say, taxes or abortion or the death penalty. But for everything else, you don't know. And that's why the other theory comes into play, the trustee theory, which says that if you're a member of Congress or whatever, you should use your best judgment and see by using your best judgment, by looking at the evidence, and vote what you think is best. And the argument there is that what you're doing there is you elect people not just to do what you say, but because you trust them, right? You say, "Hey, I think that person will make good decisions." So what model is it really? It's a little bit of both, the trustee and the delegate theory of determining how they're going to vote. Now, I think that sums it up pretty quickly. That's that whole chapter in a nutshell. What I'm going to be posting soon will be a review. So we'll talk later.